Welcome to the ID5 Identity 2021 CTO panel, which is made up of CTOs, of course. I'm Allison Schiff, one of the editors at AdExchanger, and I'm really excited to have this panel of very smart people. We have Tom Kershaw from Magnite, Anand Das from IOTA, Dave Pickles from the Trade Desk, and Diane Yu from Freewheel. And we're here to talk about, as the name of this event denotes, identity in the year to come, but also the current state of identity today. And really, I have the best people assembled here in order to do that. These are some of the people who are going to help shape the cookieless future and beyond. And there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to dispatch with any more of a preamble and just hop right in. So today, ad tech companies, as everyone knows, rely greatly on cookies for data collection, for targeting, for frequency capping, for measurement, for a lot of things. And cookies are pretty much going away, third-party cookies. Although Jeff Green at the Trade Desk is dubious about that. I've heard him say a few times he doesn't think that Google is going to go through with it, but we shall see. But yeah, so let's start off with a round robin style question about what web advertising will look like in a cookieless world. And let's start with Anand, if we could, because I know that you guys are integrated with ID5, which is interesting. But tell me a little bit about what IOTA is doing to make user data available in the ecosystem. And then we'll move on to Dave after that to talk about maybe some frequency capping and attribution.
So IOTA, is basically a data marketplace and an onboarding solution provider, which means that we have a lot of data associated with users, and there's a lot of amount of offline data that we bring online. So, if cookies go away, today cookies are the identities that are used to actually transact or transfer data from, one partner to another. So if cookies go away, we need to basically move to, another set of identifiers, which are cookieless. And there are varied identifiers out there, but the approach that IOTA has taken to basically make sure that data is portable and transactable once cookies go away is to be ID agnostic, right? A lot of people think about let's create our own identity, but out here the approach that we're taking is be ID agnostic. Look at IDs that are available out there in the market which are privacy safe, depending upon different rules in different regions, and then integrate with those and facilitate data transfer wherein we can take in data from our suppliers using identities that they want to use or that are available in that particular market, as well as be able to push data to our partners which want to use them using identities that they want to use. So it's kind of like in the middle, maintaining a map and transacting. The key out here is to basically support all the identities that are being utilized rather than focus on one. Otherwise, the platform won't be portable. So that's the approach that IOTA has been taking, and ID5 is one of the partners that we have integrated with.
Actually, before moving on to Dave, just a quick follow-up question. Like, what would be an example or two of non-cookie identifiers that you're thinking about bringing in and mapping?
Yeah, so there are a bunch. We are also closely working with Trade Desk, Identity 2.0. We are also looking at the turtle dove and sparrow discussions going on right now. They have some solution out there which is being tested for frequency and stuff, not for targeting though, which we would be interested in, as well as there are other players in the market. There is LiveRamp, there is other players like Live Intent. So we're kind of looking at a bunch of partners, and there are a few European partners also out there which provide an ID solution. But we are kind of taking an approach wherein we are kind of looking at, do they have opt-out mechanics, how they're managing privacy. So it takes time to kind of verify, validate, and then integrate with partners. And at the same time, you're kind of looking at, is this going to be challenging to your suppliers who are providing data to integrate with, and how many should they integrate, right? So you have to kind of manage the whole process, but there are a bunch of partners that we're kind of looking at. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so Dave, let's talk a little bit about frequency capping. So really from like a user experience point of view also, and then how the Trade Desk will handle something like attribution when there are no cookies anymore, or accesses pretty much, goodbye.
Well, it's not like cookies were a wonderful technology. Cookies were,
Right.
not great for consumers. They were not great for technology platforms. there was already a lot of fragmentation, kind of like what Andy was talking about. There's all these different environments, and it's already our job to make sense of it all, to say, how are we going to understand in-app, in mobile, on connected television, and digital at home? How do you do that? So there's it's not like the challenge is shifting all that much. And so there are these new technologies coming online, like ID5, like LiveRamp. There's a bunch of projects underway that are all a little different in terms of how they work. And so, what we're going to try to do is basically understand that as best we can. And what we're really trying to do is basically seize the opportunity to create an upgrade for consumers in particular. Because I think the reason that cookies are so under fire is because they are poorly understood, hard to understand. Like, even by the time you get done explaining how it all works, the average regulator is like, huh? Like, cookie mapping? What's that all about? Like, why was that ever necessary? And so, we're pretty confident that there's going to be a fabric on top of which we can do frequency mapping, that we can do attribution and all the things that we do. And I think we can actually upgrade that fabric pretty meaningfully over the next even 6 months.
It's interesting you say, cookies are little understood, because I think when you dig down deep, they are little understood. But coming out of the mouth of like my mother and my mother's friends, they're worried about cookie tracking. Like, they use the words like, oh, cookies are tracking me. They wouldn't necessarily know how to explain what's happening. But I think that really does tie into some of the firestorm that's happening around cookies, because regular people are, wondering what they're about.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
I completely agree with Dave that, cookie actually in many ways is actually misunderstood. And while deprecation of cookie will have a significant impact to our existing practice, but advanced digital marketing will survive, without cookie, and will quickly evolve to meet its, basically this anticipated workshop moment. And there are many industry trade groups have focused on, privacy compliance, identity solution, to help advertiser connecting to the audience without relying on cookie, especially at FreeWheel perspective. And when we look at that, the impact of the cookieless environment are very small portion of our impressions today, and we're basically more focused on identity resolution for the fast growing advertising platform. So it's while everybody's talking about cookie, I don't think it will have as big an impact because many part of our industry already evolved and then to move on to the next thing.
Tom,
and the reason people are upset about cookies is because we told them to be upset about cookies. You go onto any website in Europe and it says there are cookies, and there's no explanation of it. It's just like, be afraid, has been the message that's been put out about cookies. And so hopefully when we do advanced new technologies like ID5, we don't say, there's crazy stuff you don't understand happening. Instead, we can say, there's something simple happening and here's what it is.
Be afraid and be annoyed. Be very annoyed, because you're just going to be rammed with pop-ups. But yeah, I'm going to kick it over to Tom for a second, just to get the supply perspective on user identification in the future. How are you guys thinking about it at Magnite?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is the word cookie is the most irritating word in the world to me right now. I'm sick of hearing about it and talking about it. And I would just kind of extend this conversation to say the primary identity regime in every digital format is under fire, and they're all going away. It's not specific to cookies. Cookies are gone, MAIDs are gone, and using IP address to identify CTV devices is also going to be gone. They're all going to disappear. So you probably shouldn't necessarily overkey on cookies and Chrome when we're looking for villains. Cookies are one of many ways by which we currently do business. And so my view of it is, right now we have a model, whether it's IP addresses, whether it's CTV or whether it's MAIDs, whatever, we take identifiers from publishers, we give them to buyers do magical things. And the buyers create segments and they do all of these things, and that's how we transact. That's the model we need to be talking about, not the actual thing that is tossed to the buyer to create these magical segments. It's the actual process. So that's how we're looking at it. And I think that we will have a hierarchy going forward of buyers created segments, seller created segments, and browser created segments. The buyer created segments will be the most accurate, they'll have the best performance, but they won't always be there. Seller segments will do pretty well, and we can get really good at that, but they won't necessarily always be there. And then there's going to be browser created segments, which, you know, from where I sit today, will perform horrifically, but they'll be there. They'll be a thing. And there will be, the browser segments will always be there. You can assume that that will always be present as the lowest common denominator. Whether we can replicate that kind of thing in the CTV and the mobile world remains to be seen. But that's kind of the coexistence. And I don't think anyone debates whether those three things will be there. The debate is entirely how much of the internet will be covered by each and how performance will differ. You know, I think that's how we're approaching this.
And I do hear what you're saying, that this obsession with cookies in Chrome maybe obfuscates the fact that massive changes are happening everywhere. But be that as it may, you know, what has to change in terms of the way that, you know, companies operate and prepare for a cookieless future? And, you know, how far down the path, you know, are you? Because, you know, it still requires like technical changes. It still requires quite a massive to-do list of things that have to, you know, transpire as cookies go away, and then also as other identifiers go away. So since I have a bunch of CTOs with me, it would be great to get a sense of like what's really happening from a practical perspective. So Diane, maybe we can start with you.
So the identity resolution has been, if we think about this, we have to think about the overall ecosystem. And then, you know, because FreeWheel is focused on, you know, supply side platform, and supply side platform has always played a very critical role to connecting the advertiser, enable the identity for the advertiser to reach the type of audience that they want to reach. So I think those model works not only just for the overall advertising ecosystem, also for the publishers who want to create content to enable that, you know, for part of that to be monetized via advertising. So under that, assuming this model still works, and then, you know, basically our thoughts are there has to be a different way for advertiser to be able to reach the type of audience they want to reach. Therefore, the industry has to evolve. You know, let me talk through from FreeWheel perspective, since we're more focused on linear and TV. From linear and TV, our identity resolution in many ways are, you know, basically evolve from the, you know, we have to figure out, you know, the household and the individual, and then we build the graph so that it will be more like a privacy compliance. And for our advertiser to be able to reach those type of audience without knowing who they are. And then at the same time, we can actually measure. And so there are a lot of, you know, similar type of solution out there already. And then I think it's more about, you know, basically creating the type of graphic information where one can connect at the same time, also privacy compliance. I believe that's the key. And because the advertising industry will evolve, and without the need of having cookie and having for sure like a mate type of, you know, identifier.
Well, and Dave, kind of the same question. What does a product roadmap look like with all of this uncertainty? And I mean, maybe it's actually certain, like Tom was saying, it's certain that everything is changing, but that still is, you know, a tricky thing as you're developing products and thinking about, you know, the future and sprints and all of that. So, you know, what's changing for you? Of course, the Trade Desk is spearheading Unified ID 2.0, for example. I mean, that's a big thing.
Well, so I mean, we're all in Unified ID 2.0 together first. Like that is such a community effort. And so like Andy said earlier, we're working together on that. We're working with everybody on that because I think that there needs to be a ubiquitous free way to do identification. You know, we have been pushing on it, but it's very much not a Trade Desk thing. You know, I think that in terms of what we need to do with the platform, it's been an evolution where, you know, it started out with, we all kind of thought, hey, cookies are totally anonymous and safe. So maybe we can have like 4 security practices and it'll be okay. But that, you know, isn't true. Like, you know, as we've dug deeper on it, even when you just have cookie data, we've needed to have security practices, but now everyone is going to need to make a series of decisions about what their relationship is going to be with more personal data. Because that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about post-cookie is we need something to tie an identity to, or to tie preferences to, or to tie personalization to. And that thing will either be an email address or it'll be a phone number, most likely. And so, you know, and I think in America, it's much more likely to be email address. And I'm not sure Americans are ready for phone number. In most of Asia, people are more comfortable using phone numbers, might not even have an email address. So, you know, that'll be something that we'll have to consider. And then there's a whole lot of technical actual heavy lifting to do to get ready to safely process data, or to figure out how you're going to anonymize it outside your platform, to do it through a partnership with a LiveRamp or 95 or whatever you're going to do. You know, I think there's a lot of thinking to do about what your relationship is going to be with data, and then go execute that. Then there's the question of caching data, which is the most expensive thing any DSP does, is having a real-time cache ready to go with all of the data that we want to target on. And if there's 25 IDs and I have to store the data 25 times, that's going to get really, really expensive. And so there is a need to, like, well, it's great to have diversity. We also need to find commonality, and we need to find ways to do mapping and create standards so that we can have DSPs able to cache 3, 4, or 5 times, which I'm willing to do. I'm willing to 5x my cache cost in this process. That's okay. 25x is possible even for us, but imagine a startup DSP, somebody trying to break into the business like that. It's not ideal to make it this hard to enter the game.
Tom, I'm curious what you think about email as the basis for identity in the future. Does that something that rings true to you? Like, that's what it's going to be, email, something authenticated?
That will be one option. I think that there will be cases where users opt into something, and there will be cases where they do not. I think that that's one of the big changes that we kind of gloss over as an industry, is that right now all the identities we use, we never asked anyone for them. We just did it. We just either put the cookie on the page or grabbed a made off the device that no one understands what that even is, or we used CTB related signals the users don't know. What we're proposing now is to actually tell them, here's what's going on. You need to give us something, or we'd like you to volunteer or opt into a regime. That's the transition we're going through now. And it is huge. And I think we're underestimating the severity of that. So yes, in order to get email addresses to use them as a cross-site identity tool that buyers can create segments on, requires talking to people. Ugh, what a horrible thing. How are we going to do that? I mean, we are an SSP, and I think most of us in this panel are technology providers. We're engineers. We don't talk to people. That's what we're bad at. So somehow we have to figure out how to talk to the users of the internet, how the internet works. Once we've got that dialogue in place, then we're building plumbing to do that. So I think there will be cases where we have either an anonymized email address or phone number. You're right to point out email addresses don't exist in APAC, so you have to have some other mechanism. And so you'll have some amount of the internet, debate the percentage, that are volunteering that information, then have others that do not, and we have to figure out how we piece all of that together. So I think it's a part of the internet, but I'm also, like, as a technological, as a purist a little bit, I'm like, do I really want an internet based on people surrendering PII? I mean, yes, I want people to have the option to do that, but I don't expect it will be all of the internet.
So I want to get into, in a minute, some of the challenges related to, using authenticated data, as the underpinning of a portion, say, of users on the internet. But Anand, can I call you Andy? I heard someone call you Andy.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's what I use.
Cool. So from your perspective, and kind of thinking of what Tom was just saying, I don't know if you can say, but like, what percentage do you think will end up being authenticated, and what won't be authenticated? Like, just to toss it out there, if you were a gambling man, I don't know if you are.
I'm not a gambling man, but I'd say it kind of depends upon, if you kind of look at the privacy regulations. I would say percentile, because it depends upon whom you're working with and who has that coverage. But I'd say most of the US can be authenticated using email addresses, right, or hashes or sorts of those nature on that part. In Asia, people are okay to actually give mobile phone numbers. Using email addresses out there means you'll have multiple identities for the same person, because people use different email addresses for different things. In Europe, especially, there might be, I'd say the amount of addressability that you'll have with email addresses will be lower, given the privacy regulations out there. In which scenario, you might have to depend upon probabilistic identifiers, cohort IDs, something which basically doesn't correlate to a user might correlate to a group, as Dan mentioned, right? The household stuff, you'll have a cohort of users out there, but it will be more probabilistic out there than other areas. So high in US, low in Europe, and China is out of the question, right? All government control. But if you kind of look at Asia, it'll be a varied thing. People are okay with email addresses and phone numbers, but I'll go with more phone numbers for accuracy.
And then sticking with authentication, it really is still a small proportion of the addressable market. And like Tom was saying, like, talking to people, like that's hard, that's challenging, and getting opt-ins is not, a trivial matter. So there really is, I think, a big challenge, in that, but it's something that the industry is really, thinking about and coalescing on. But are there ways to make authenticated cookieless identification more scalable? Like, what would be some strategies for doing that? Dave, maybe you want to start with that one.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Tom said about explaining what's happening. And so, like, creating content isn't free, never has been. It gets paid for with ads. We need to do a better job of explaining that. Like, the whole, like, you can kind of get content for free. You can run an ad blocker and you can still get content. That's what we're going to need to address for any of this to work. We needed to address this anyway, even if we're sticking with cookies, to help just explain the pro quo of the internet and how things get funded. So if we can do that, I think we'll be very successful in making stuff like this work. If you look at like what happened with Geo on the iPhone, so the iPhone in-app made it so that apps had to ask for permission to collect Geo. Apps that convinced users that they needed Geo to operate did very well at getting that authorization. And apps that didn't need it did very poorly, right? Which is what you'd expect. And so I think every app and every website needs to explain why a consumer should let it do tracking, do personalization, pay for content, or if they want to pay, that's fine too. But we're going to need to force the rules. We're going to need publishers to enforce the rules. If you don't pay or provide some data, there needs to not be content, or there needs to be limited content available, or I think it will take longer to scale if we can't. But I also think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And if you look at like the CTV environment, I think it's probably easier than figuring this out on every website, because people are used to logging into the app. They're used to like, I have to pay for TV. I think the quid pro quo is more well understood TV than it is the internet. And since that's kind of where a lot of all this is going in, I think that bodes well for a chance.
This is maybe. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. Since free will is actually in a lot of those impressions we see in the CTV environment, I feel strongly about that. Even though right now it's actually a small portion of the addressable market, but we do see a trend where basically publishers adopting the paywall, and then which actually require you to authenticate and in order to basically watch the content, and that trend has been going up. I think by our research, we look at that, basically the trend going up like by 2x over the last year. And then there's also growth rate higher in US and then Australia. So we think in the future, it's actually going to be gradually, there'll be more and more, higher portion of the users will be authenticated. And then there are a lot of solutions out there talking about problematic, a probabilistic approach. And I do think those type of approach will create some problem where it's resulting in a game of cat and mouse type of game, where ad tech company like us, find a certain things that it can be, basically can help to reach those users not authenticated. However, then later on, company like Apple, Google will come in and close those type of loophole, if you will. So long term is not the right solution, and I echo so much with what Dave is saying. It's actually reasonable, and then it will be more and more reasonable to actually ask people to authenticate themselves in order to have the service, in order to have all other service providers providing the right type of service for them.
And does anyone know how this is going to happen? How are we going to explain the quid pro quo of the internet? Because I feel like there has been a very bad job of that in the past. I don't think a lot of people really understand the dotted lines between content creation and monetization, and the existence of this content. So that's kind of a jump ball.
That's because it's complicated. How do you explain I don't know how the internet works, and I work in it. I mean, I think it's quite a complicated thing to explain to someone who really just wants a recipe for something, or is trying to read a news article about something else. I mean, I think that explaining to users has to be done collectively. This is something that I really respect what the Trade Desk has done here, because they're saying, listen, we have to get publishers together to speak with one voice, because if everybody speaks a different way of explaining the internet, you're going to confuse everybody. So there has to be some collaboration on this. But the other thing is, you're going to be a little bit of a skeptic. You're not going to be able to explain the internet to the average person. They can't, there's no way they're going to understand it. So the other method you have, in addition to explaining it, is to alter the user experience. So if the user has a different experience, if they've authenticated than if they don't, that's really a bigger driver. So what does that different experience mean? It means you can see content or access content that you couldn't otherwise, or your ad experience is better or different. So for example, seeing 2 ads that you actually kind of sort of don't hate versus seeing 20 that you totally hate, that's a user experience difference. So it may not be what we're going for as an industry, but it's an example of the user experience will drive behavior as much as the explanation. We have both levers.
And there's actually a bunch of different projects out there that have UX around this already that we've been discovering as we've started all the conversations with Unified ID. You know, we were brewing some ourselves, and then there's a few others, and they're great. Like, it's actually, like, Tom, you're right, it is complicated, but like just saying like, hey, it's not free, you got to pay for it some way, and we've altered the experience, that's not a lot of words to fit on a screen. It's actually a lot less words than the crazy notification that we've been doing with PR that like kind of like says everything and nothing and nobody understands it. If you just like have 3 bullets and it says how it works, I think it's pretty. And
again, like, if you kind of look at all the privacy things today, the consent mechanics and stuff, it's a standard legal language. If you throw it at someone, this is why I track you and stuff, people are like, I don't know what it means, I need this. You click OK most of the times, right? And they don't understand. And it's you're giving them so much amount of information that somebody's going to do it, right? Like, so as Dave and Tom mentioned, right, in a simple way to actually differentiate, which is visual, where people understand what they are going to miss out, what they're gonna get, is easy. And again, like, right now it kind of looks like, you have outsourced it to, some guy who's working with, hundreds of people and listing all of them on the page. People are like, what is this? So, either you say yes to everyone or you say no, but you don't know what is happening. You don't know who has your data, whom are you sharing it with, and that creates a big chaos. That's where, people shoot cookies. So, that's what is creating problem. And even today, I'd say as Dave and Tom are talking about it, like, the explanation, we're trying to do it collectively, but, it needs to happen. It needs to progress much more quickly than what it is right now, because, still people are like, I'm being tracked. I don't know why am I being tracked for, right? And not all advertising is bad, but, if you kind of look at tracking, it has different meanings for different people. And that's not being clear as of today on the internet.
I think we've seen this movie before, right? And so there's an example of a successful way to talk to a user and an example of an unsuccessful way. So let me give you the unsuccessful way. CMPs for GDPR. Ugh, horrible. Not a good way to tell the user how the internet works, to show them a list of 600 companies they never heard of and ask them to do something. Good example is what Dave described, ad blocking. When ad blocking started to happen, publishers came up with ways to talk to the users, and it was quite simple. Like, look at the UK news industry. What they basically said was, we can't pay our reporters and write these articles if you don't turn off your ad blocker. That was it. It was like 2 sentences, no forcing function, no withholding of content. Just, will you please turn off your ad blocker for this site? And like 40% of people did. It was a real simple message, and it was somewhat successful. So I think we do have the ability to talk to users. We just have to collectively choose the right path.
And oh, go ahead, Andy.
No, I just wanted to kind of reiterate that is very important, because when people think about authenticated, they use the same mechanics that they've been using right now. So the percentiles look very, very low. But if you're very open, saying that, hey, if you give me this, I can give you a bunch more of more functionality, then people will readily authenticate. How many people actually like newsletters and sign up for it, right? Lots. There are a lot of businesses which run on it, right? And everywhere, not only in the US, in Europe, and other places. So this is a real valid way to do it. The thing is, if you want to do it the old route without asking the user, that's the problem, right? And I think the more we move towards openness and transparency, the more coverage we'll get on authenticated traffic. across the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as Tom was saying at the beginning, this is not just about cookies. This is about mobile device IDs also, and kind of on the cusp of Optin for IDFA, and there's just going to be this little space that you have to explain a complicated value proposition, although perhaps not that complicated. This app is free because, but considering there's just very little space in order to do that, what do you guys think opt-in rates will be after the app tracking transparency framework comes into play? Anyone want to take that one?
I think it'll be really strong for apps that provide a good experience. And so, yeah, you don't just have that one chance though. You can go into settings and change it, or at least I hope that's what they implement. So then the app can have an ongoing conversation with you, and that's what makes it actually work well. And so it'll be asymptotic. At first, it'll be low, and then it'll grow, and it'll peak out at some point. I think when IDFA made their announcement that this is what they were going to do, I actually celebrated it pretty publicly. I think, hey, at least they're asking the consumer what they want. When they made their change in Safari, the premise was basically like, the consumer's too stupid to understand this, so we're going to make all the decisions for them with our clever AI, which really isn't terribly clever. And I think that's a really bad direction to go. So at least now in the in-app half of your iPhone, there's a little bit of honesty, and just all the hypocrisy that's between the handling between those two environments. It's just fascinating. I think eventually has to get resolved to the point where the experience is the same. I don't see why you'd have a different experience for an app or website. I've had a few people try to argue that the vetting that occurs before you can enter the App Store makes it so that it's a totally different environment. I don't agree with that. I think the same thing either way.
Do you guys agree with that? Do you feel like that's what we're going to see, kind of low, and then it'll build, as people realize that this is the way things are and this is how they get their apps for free?
I feel, in many ways, I feel that they also need to require, basically require we have the industry need to come with some standard, so that will be very easy for the user to do it. Right now, it feels like, especially following the GDPR, and a lot of websites, when you go, you have to click on OK. If the user experience become like that, for every single place I go, I have to click on OK, that become annoying, right? So we, and I think this is where, a collective industry body could come together and come up with a framework to be able to do that easily for the user, and then the opt-in rate will be pretty high, and that they know what to anticipate. I think that hasn't happened yet.
I'm a little more skeptical. I think that
yeah.
I think it depends on the answer. It depends on how the question is posed, right? And I think that we in the advertising industry will propose. Well, we would pose a question like, would you like to have highly targeted, specialized ads as well as free content? Yeah, sounds pretty good. If you're Apple, it's like, do you want these losers to track you? I mean, yeah, probably not. It's really the same question. It's just asked in a different way. So I think the current version of how Apple is expressing this within the app is a little more towards the latter than the former. So how the question is posed is relevant. And I think my view of what I've seen so far is that the way they're posing the question will have more negatives than you would think. But the good thing about what they're doing, to Dave's point, is you can re-adjudicate it, and it's also consistent. The thing I like about what Apple's doing is they're asking the same question in each app the same way, so you don't get into this user confusion thing. So seeing the same question multiple times, users tend to develop more refined answers. So I think that bodes well for it, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
It's my understanding as well that you as the app developer, the publisher, you can decide when you want to pop that up. So somebody can have some fun with your app first, they can see that they like it, and then you can test as to when is the optimal moment to ask. So it's not like you download something and then it's just that flurry of opt-ins where my finger or something has a life of its own. I just tap a whole bunch of things to make those go away before I even read them, and I'm in the industry. I do that every time. Like, it's just the reptile part of my brain. So let's talk a little bit, because we already are talking about privacy, of course, and identity and privacy are two sides of the same coin. Let's get a little bit into regulation, because of course, regulation has to impact roadmap, and it has to impact, what gets developed, of course, because it has to be in compliance. And, most privacy regulations have privacy by design baked into them. For the development process. So it would be great to just get a quick sense of how your platforms are getting ready to handle different privacy regulations in different countries. We just had CPRA pass on the ballot in California, which strengthens CCPA. So we don't have to hammer on and on about the nuances of GDPR and CCPA and CPRA, because lots of panels have done that in the past. But really, from the CTO perspective, how you think about development with these things in the background. Andy, maybe we can start with you.
So, on in a marketplace, we get data from everywhere. So, the important piece is based on where we are getting the data from, who's the supplier, where the actual user is, if there is a online identity associated with it. We need to kind of check if the user actually knows that this data is going to be with us, right? So maybe it's a supplier or whatever. We basically look for those signals. If those signals are not there, then that data is discarded. So anything that comes in has to be user consented, approved, and verified before it gets into the platform. Kind of stop it out there. Even data that comes in offline, we kind of look at consent signals. There might be some online partners which are basically sending us data offline. We still look at consent signals. And we are totally okay with discarding anything that doesn't have user consent. When we started, we had a big drop in Europe, but kind of grew up pretty nicely over a period of time. As you kind of talk to users, they know what is happening. So that's one thing. And then you have different rules and regulations. If you kind of look at with GDPR, certain things are not possible in CCPA. There are certain things that are possible, but there are also some other regulations, like you need to kind of note down what happened in the last 12 years and so on. So what we do is we build towards the policies that are coming up in different geolocations, but at the same time take the best and restrictive things across those and build it across the platform to kind of make sure that if this restriction comes tomorrow in some other geography, we are already ready for it. Don't kind of look at it like it's like an opening for now to make money, but kind of look at it as this is where the world will go to, and can we basically survive? So how do we make a platform which is much more privacy safe, and make sure that there's nothing that user has not consented to on our platform? And it's a continuous process. It's not something which is like a one-time fix that you do. You have to continuously kind of keep on checking. For every functionality that you build in, there's a review process that goes through before it actually goes live, to make sure that it's completely privacy safe, right down from getting the data to logging it to whatever is available on the platform. So it's an involved process.
How does Magnite do it?
How do we? Well, I mean,
right now, the thinking process.
Well, I mean, here's the thinking process. So here's what I would say to all this. This is a mess of epic proportions. I have nothing positive to say about it. And here's what I mean. Okay. Right now, we have a bunch of regulatory stuff where different regulators make different decisions about what privacy is or is not, and what consent is or is not. And it's a different definition. Even within Europe, each country has a different interpretation of the GDPR. Then you've got the US version where you could have potentially different regulations in different states, and you have Brazil and all these other geographies. Right? Then you have the browsers coming in saying, no, these regulators don't know what they're talking about. We know what privacy is. Here's what we're going to do to protect privacy. Then you've got this industry effort that we're between pre-bid and UID2 and all these things. The industry is trying to say, no, here's what we're going to do with privacy. And these three different regimes conflict with each other. They don't work together correctly. They're not talking to each other. So from a technical perspective, you have these three different systems defining privacy, which are clashing, right? And as we go further down this road and the browser definition becomes more mature, and then you have more regulations, and those regulations change, and then we successfully start to self-regulate, which, by the way, is why we're in this situation in the first place, because we didn't figure this out 5 years ago when we could have. These systems are going to be incompatible. So we're going to have a huge engineering challenge to make sure, like we have this problem now, like we have a user ID that's consented, but then when do we run a GDPR check against that, and which one takes precedence over which? This is a huge engineering disaster. I have nothing good to say about it.
Awesome. What about from the freewheel perspective?
It's a big education process for sure, you know, and the regulatory compliance is very critical. And then we know GDPR is starting, CCPA, there will be a lot more follow. So I remember back to the days, you know, right before, you know, the whole regulation on GDPR started, I spent a lot of time really is self-educating, educating the team what it means. And at the very beginning, I agree with Tom, there's like a, you know, there's very different interpretation and nobody knows what's, you know, what this really means. So, you know, we're spending a lot of time with lawyers now, you know, basically discussing how to interpret those properly. And then when they turn that around and applying to the technology platform, I think after we go through such a rigorous, you know, review and then looking at our platform and then changing, taking things out of our platform to make sure, ensure that we are, you know, compliant. And one thing for sure is this is truly not one-time effort. Because, you know, it's you know, we see a lot of company actually reacting to those that we, you know, basically they react more aggressively or conservatively in many ways that, you know, we have to make sure that, you know, we follow. So it has become the way how we design our system going forward. It's challenging from technical engineering perspective because the data you used to be able to access very easily now no longer, okay? But I think after those type of education, and then, you know, we go through putting in a place that right now we're actually more, you know, proportionally biased toward being more conservative. So for any future regulation going through, we will have an easier time to go through because we know that, you know, all the companies putting in the resource and effort to actually take a more conservative approach. Still yet to be said, you know, it is certainly a lot of, you know, engineering resources spent on that to make sure our platform is privacy compliant.
So, oh, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, and at any instant of time, you know, it's like, you know, the privacy never ends, right? As Dan mentioned, right? You know, there are some engineers always working on it. And this conservative thing, right? You know, taking the best thing from all the policies that you know is going to go away, right? So, for example, IDFA, right? You know, Apple made an announcement right now, but, you know, if you talk to Dave or Tom, you know, we knew it was coming for like, or it will happen at some point in time because people were misusing it. So, you know, so the industry changes or makes an announcement, but, you know, people know that, you know, this is coming. So, you know, how do you kind of get off of it? One thing that we have been doing since a long time is like, you know, just make sure that no PII gets in, right? And that actually saves a lot of amount of headache. But, you know, at the same time, you have to kind of make sure that nobody's sneaking it in at some point in time. So it's a continuous effort. Over to you, Dave.
Oh, actually, I have, if you don't mind, like a tweak to the question a little bit, because obviously regulation is important, but you could argue that when platforms make changes, they are far more immediate than any changes that might happen because of regulations, say enforcement. You know, it takes a really like a long time for a regulator to enforce a law. And so do you have to prioritize platform changes on a product roadmap? Or obviously you have to also think about regulation, but you know, like Apple, when they make a decision, they essentially can flip a switch and that change is in effect. Regulation takes a little bit more time to really permeate throughout an ecosystem.
And regulation's a symptom, right? Regulation happens because there's something going on that's bothering someone. And so what we've transitioned to is try to think through before we build something, are we doing the right thing? Is it explainable? And I've been thinking, is it regulatable? As we've been designing, especially the UID2 stuff, I think that it actually is regulatable in a way that's going to work well. You know, like Tom was saying, all the headache about GDPR isn't us implementing the lawmakers' intent. It's that like there's conflict in it. It doesn't work with the tech, and so we've been trying to sort that. But having done that, yeah, you can look at all of these environments and say, like, where's the wind blowing? What do we think is going to happen? Let's get prepared for it. We've also just gone through a process of dealing with a lot of fragmentation, complexity. Saying earlier, like it's just going to change. It's going to be a patchwork. You know, you can't stand there and like shout and say there should be a national law and we shouldn't do CCPA. It's not going to do it. Not going to do any good to be mad. You just got to be prepared. And so yeah, it has been a big shift. I think at this point though, it's been going on for so long. Like when GDPR happened, it was a huge problem. There's a couple of really big companies that kind of woke up a couple of weeks after it went into effect and decided to get involved. And that made it really hard. I don't think in the industry we're making those.
I think we have time for one more question, and I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the W3C a little bit. To bring us home, what do you guys all make of the progress, or maybe the lack thereof, some would argue, that's happening, particularly in the Improving Web Advertising Business Group at the W3C right now, which is where all of the Chrome privacy sandbox proposals are being hashed out, and you might say debated, you might say coming down from on high, however you see it. Go ahead, yeah. Dave, you.
I think the question is W3C Google or isn't it? Because like from on high, which on high is that? And so what we've observed at W3C is Google's kind of just telling people what to do, and everybody says I don't like that idea, and then they do it anyway. So we are continuing to track against it, but it seems pretty clear what's happening.
So is there progress being made, though, even with that as a backdrop? Tom, what do you got to say? I know you have opinions.
Yeah, I think there's progress being made, and it's slower than some of us would like, but we are actively participating in this, and we have stood up sandboxes, we've stood up prototypes, and I think we may have misinterpreted, I think some of the industry is applying an IAB resolution approach to W3C. They don't work that way. We don't sit around explain, debating ad infinitum what this all means and then do it 3 years later. The W3C works by saying, I agree with, here's what we're going to do. And we say, I don't agree with it. And they do it anyway. So you have to adopt that methodology, which is, I don't care what they say. This is what we think will work. And where we've gotten to with the W3C is there's a privacy versus utility trade-off. So you can be completely and totally private, have no information about a user ever going anywhere. There's a good way to do that. Just turn the internet off. Done. Totally private. Or you can have a completely monetization-driven internet and ignore the user's privacy. That's also not a good idea. But somewhere along that continuum of privacy to utility, we'll get to some proposals that will be worthwhile. So there are a bunch of things that are happening there. There are prototypes being driven. I don't think this is going to replace third-party cookies by January of 2022, and the performance fall-off will be massive. But there is progress being made. One last point on this is Google has this study they put out about the lift that you get from moving to a turtle dove model over random. And the bar they set was random. So basically what they said was, just put ads on pages without knowing anything, just randomly blow them out there. And it's that's not what we do. That's not the right bar. So just explaining to them, the bar is the current system. This is the existing third-party cookie regime that everybody hates so much. And that's going to be replaced by these other things. And what is the fallout? The fallout from moving to turtle dove from the existing regime is going to be big, but it may be acceptable in some cases. So that's the kind of analysis I think we need to have. It's going slower than I would like, but it's not worthless. And whatever we do, the device manufacturers, whether they're CTV boxes or mobile phones or browsers, are going to be part of the ecosystem, and we're going to have to deal with it. And to just say we're going to ignore it is not the thing for me.
I mean, for a skeptic, I feel like that is a pretty positive
endorsement.
Yeah. I feel like that's a good note to end it on, unless Diane or Andy, you have any parting thoughts for us. All right, cool. Well, guys, thank you. Thank you for that. Tom, Andy, Dave, Diane, I feel like this was a great conversation, and appreciate it.
Thanks to ID5 for inviting us and for setting this up. This has been great, and always a pleasure to be with such an esteemed group.
Same here. Thank you.